Today's class, we are starting Human Settlement Societies, Chapter 8. I want us to remember that, as we talked about at the end of the Biological Anthropology unit, humans spread out all over the world using hunting and gathering, adapted to different climates, transformed them, started living in places you didn't think humans could ever live before, everywhere. So that was perhaps our most sustainable and most successful evolutionary strategy of getting food is hunting and gathering. But in this unit, of course, we start talking about something we call domestication. What's domestication? So humans start to relate to plants and to certain plants and animals in new ways. And those new ways, the plants and animals start to relate to humans in new ways as well as some plants and animals become dependent on humans for their reproduction, while humans start to become dependent on those plants and animals, and in some ways do what they want them to do. So enter into this mutual process, which develops, in certain places of the world, not everywhere, but in certain places, you have this more intensive planting and cultivating process that we call agriculture. Now, we also see in this unit, starting in the very beginning, the rise of more densely populated areas, like this city of Teotihuacan. And in fact, you can see these little tiny people here. That's how big these pyramids and stuff are. It's a pretty impressive place. And he shouldn't have to pronounce Teotihuacan because, in fact, we don't know what this city was called. Teotihuacan is the name that the Aztecs gave to it as they were making their way toward where they would eventually build their cities. They came upon the ruins of this city. So it had risen and fallen before the Aztecs even got there. And they said, we'll call it Teotihuacan. We must be from these great people and we'll build cities like this. And so the later great Aztec cities, Tenochtitlan, for example, what would later become, after the Spaniards burned the original down, Mexico City. But this city was, again, in some ways, we don't know who exactly did it. So we see here, and this is important throughout our exploration of these things that we call societies, because we often see these as places that are disconnected from each other and everybody has their own little language and their little culture, their little society. And that's not the way things seem to have gone. In fact, when we see some of these early settlements, we see different people coming together, being quite diverse. It mentions that we think that there were at least 5 different languages spoken within the city of Teotihuacan, and they would have been connected to a wider region with lots of back and forth between this region. So now, when we see these little tiny people in a big pyramid like this, what do we think must have happened in order to make those people build that big pyramid? This is a strange question. Big pyramids, little people. How did they do that? Well, they certainly would have needed some tools for sure. We're talking, when we get into this phase of society, we're talking major tool use and be able to transport things from place to place, move things around. If I told you to build this pyramid, would you do it? Yeah, I could. Well, that's what we think about, right? We think about that and especially the Europeans, when they found these places, they thought, there must be a king. There must be a central government, and these people must be enslaved so that they tell them what to do. Build that damn pyramid now. Because like you said, you wouldn't do it. If I told you to do it, you'd just be like, no, I'm gonna do something else. Don't want to build a big pyramid. It doesn't seem to be the case, though. In many of these early urban settlements, the more we're discovering archaeologically, the assumption that these had to be centrally governed by some king or ruling figure in an enslaved population, certainly there must have been some form of hierarchy. But it seems like, at least in Teotihuacan and some of the other early settlements, that people were able to come together and coordinate projects like this without necessarily having a huge centralized authority. This is still an archaeological puzzle because there's no evidence in Teotihuacan that there was a king or a central ruler. So how did they do these things without necessarily being in a hierarchical situation or the kinds of hierarchy that we know about? So it's just something to keep in mind. Now, we actually start back with primates forming into groups. A lot of you love these primates forming into groups. There's baboons. It was very fascinating to many. What are those baboons doing to be able to protect their territory? Yeah, there they are, all standing up on two legs. Even baboons, look at those. They're not even apes, and there they are standing around looking around for predators. And as several of you put it, it is fascinating, the idea that you're selfishly trying to avoid being the next meal for a predator. And so you group up like that, you get into a herd. So there are some advantages. There's living in groups like this, especially for the scrawny Homo sapien primate, which was probably more hunted than a hunter, would have advantages to be there. Living in close proximity spreads disease, and people have to share food with others. Yeah, geez, what does that sound like to you? Sounds like now. Look at you all grouped up together, spreading diseases and having to share food. Yuck. Yeah, terrible. So there are some drawbacks to this, but in general, this has been our mode of life. And what we see here is what we call prosocial behavior, which is that people, I mean, you might do something because it's being selfish. You don't want to get eaten by a predator, but eventually that evolves into the idea that you might sacrifice or do something for the group, which isn't necessarily advantageous to you as an individual. So humans and other primates are often taking care of other people's kids or helping each other out in ways that don't necessarily make sense if it's just every person for herself. Humans especially are prone to this kind of prosocial behavior, which means we are prone to form societies. And like I said, in this period of time, before about 12,000 years ago, we see humans in these small groups generally. They don't congregate into large groups. Sometimes seasonally they would, but not permanently. And most of them had a relatively egalitarian structure. Now, by egalitarian, what we mean here is not that everybody's equal. There's still probably differences in gender and status and probably by age and those kinds of things, but people are approximately equal. There's not huge differences in wealth and power within these societies, in part because you can't accumulate and store wealth. There's no place we have with hunter-gatherers, of course, is they're getting their food through their knowledge of wild plants and the seasonality and where you can find them, and their knowledge of how to trap or hunt wild animals. And it may be that the people who are better able to do that might get more status in that society, but you're not going to be able to accumulate hordes of wealth because these are resources that go away over time. And so be careful here, and we have different ideas of what it means to be egalitarian. In our society, we just simply mean that we hope people have an equal chance to get a lot of money and power. But in this case, we're talking about people who are relatively, not completely, but relatively equal, and they're not accumulating money and power individually over time. Now, what's interesting about these societies, which we didn't think of before, what are they like in terms of how many people are there and what they're doing there? Yeah, so we actually see in these societies, changed our views over time on these. We do see a lot of interaction between these groups. We see a fair amount of diversity and cooperation both within and among different groups. And we used to think of these as simply governed by kinship or family. They would be kinship bands. And that's certainly important. Kinship is going to be important in every society. But studies of contemporary gatherers and hunters, and there are people who do live in a gathering and hunting lifestyle, show that actually they're very mobile and that most of the groups will have more non-kin in them than kin. So people will be coming in and joining from different groups. And people tend to, as a percentage of the population, they tend to travel more than we do as a percentage of the population. So they're actually less sedentary and more willing to go into different places. In some ways, these societies were much more fluid than we once believed about them. So this is how people lived for many, many years, and some still do. About 12,000 years ago, there was a change in the climate. So between, I'm going to say between about 100,000 years ago up to about 12,000 years ago, the Earth was pretty cold. And there were glaciers and ices, ice ages, and all those ice age movies came out. Around 12,000 years ago, that came to an end, and we were left with a more stable and warmer climate. There was a receding of these glaciers, and it made possible some of these other plants and animals to flourish. So we really never could have developed agriculture before about 12 to 15,000 years ago. It just wouldn't have worked on a widespread scale. Now, a couple different things happened. One, many of these places had very big mammals, and there's some debate about why these mammals went extinct. Some people want to blame the humans who came into these areas and were hunting them, and that probably contributed to that, but it probably had a lot to do with the changing climate. Some of these big mammoths and things like that you see in the Ice Age movies, they go away. But it opens up new areas for a more diverse, smaller species of plants and animals. And so we have this warming period that has been with us for the last 12,000 years. I just want to say here that to put this in context, you might be like, oh, cool, it's warm now. 74 degrees today, great. It's just like the old days. Climate change is good. The more it warms up, the better it gets. Not true, actually. We look at what's happening today or where our projections are for what will happen in the future. Humans have never lived as humans on an Earth as warm as we project it's going to be. It'd be nicer if we kept it around this level instead of ratcheting it up beyond where humans evolved to be a part of. So just be careful of that. This warming did help back then with the emergence of agriculture and other things, but it doesn't mean making it warmer still is going to help us out. In this time, there was more extensive cultivation of land. There were more areas that were able to be cultivated. And we probably shouldn't forget that this was also what we might call a golden age for hunting and gathering. So opening up more areas to cultivation and management, because the hunters and gatherers were not just passively collecting tubers or collecting berries. They were actively involved in managing the plants and animal species in their areas. The textbook mentions that in indigenous Australia, which did not develop any domestication or agriculture, in part because there were no native species there which were really amenable to be domesticated. And if we look at Australia today, all the things that it has there that is domesticated, those were all imported from outside. However, the people who were indigenous to Australia had developed a very great land and coastal resource management system, which people don't understand to this day because in part the European colonizers thought it was dumb and so tried to eliminate people. And the same thing actually happened in this area of the world. Whereas your textbook mentioned, many indigenous peoples use fire, controlled fire, to reshape entire landscapes. So what you do when you use fire is you encourage the growth of certain plant and animal species that are the kinds of plants and animals that you want. So in the northeast of North America and all across North America, you see indigenous Americans or indigenous peoples using fire to reshape their entire world. It's almost like having a huge garden to tend. And then the Europeans come in and they're like, oh, this is great. It's like the Garden of Eden here. And they thought that that was the natural state of things. But once they displaced the indigenous peoples and got rid of them, the environment actually deteriorated. So they didn't realize that the peoples there were keeping things together. It was in some ways a better environment because they had these indigenous techniques. So we just want to be careful here before we enter into the talking about domestication to help us understand that the people who were hunting and gathering had an intimate knowledge of their land, and they were actually also managing and working it as well. But in various regions, we have a process or a change in certain plants and animals, which we call domestication, which you've heard about a little bit. But what happens here? What's going on with that? What the heck? That corn. Yeah, humans like to have bigger seeds. We like to have things that will be good. And there's certain plants that are more, it's easier to do this with certain plants than it is with others. So it's not that you can do this with all the plants, but some plants have mutations which can be selected for over generations where they will get larger fruit, you might say, and that fruit doesn't disperse into the wind. It'll be held on there. Now, I put the word favorable in quotes because this is a favorable mutation for humans. It would not have been a favorable mutation in the wild. In the wild, this would be an unfavorable mutation. But for humans, it actually helps them out because they're able to then harvest this. So we see this domestication process in various plants, different places in the world, various animals. And your textbook gives you a helpful map of different areas of the world where different crops were independently domesticated. So people were in contact with each other across this range, but they weren't in contact all the way through here. These were independent places where people domesticated the things in their area. So it's roughly around the same time in different regions of the world. I do want to be careful. When we say roughly 1,000, 2,000 years or so is close, but not in human terms, it's quite a long time. But it's not the same species. So be careful with this. There are certain species in each of these areas which are available for domestication, but it's not the same. So we have here the potato, and then we have maize or corn over here. We have wheat and barley here, and we have Asian rice over here, yam and bananas over here. So it's not the same species. After a while, some of these species get moved into different places. It's also not the same animals. Some people had large herd animals, other people did not. So we have here is, again, the first two parts of these we know about the domestication process where the humans are starting to interact with plants and animals in new ways and trying to play a role in the selection process of favorable mutations. This seems to occur roughly around the same time, certainly not much before 12,000 years ago, but it only occurs with the stuff that you can domesticate in that area. And it creates this mutual dependency. So the humans become dependent, well, the domesticated species become dependent on humans for their reproduction and survival, because the humans have selected these mutations that are favorable for them in domesticated situations, but are not good if the animal were simply back in the wild. And of course, the humans become dependent on those domesticated species for survival.